and welcome to this week's episode. So, since our last time together, we've had the NBA and NHL join Major League Baseball in returning to play. It sure feels good to be betting on pro sports again, doesn't it? So, thank you to everyone who watched my last pre-recorded webcast, which was called Betting Baseball 2020. That was very well received, and I appreciate all of you who watched it and liked it. I'm going to stick with baseball betting again today and go over some of the factors that go into baseball handicapping that a lot of bettors sometimes ignore or just don't know about. But first, let me remind you that if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up down below. That helps YouTube identify it as quality content for other viewers that are searching for similar topics. And also, consider subscribing to my channel. I produce educational sports betting videos, and I really appreciate it when I see my subscriber count continue to increase. So today we're talking about the 5 hidden factors of betting baseball. Now, as I alluded to in my video Betting Baseball 2020, baseball seems like a very intuitive sport to bet on given its reliance and correlation to statistics. It's what got me interested in betting baseball, and it also seems simple to handicap for many when they think about betting it. There's often a lack of parity in baseball. In any given season, you'll have teams that win over 100 games, and you'll have teams that win 30 to 40 games less than that. It seems you could handicap just based on the starting pitcher, for instance. They seem to be crucial to a team's success or failure in any given game. And that's true. Take, for instance, Steve Carlton in 1972, pitching for the Philadelphia Phillies. Carlton won 27 games that year, and the entire Phillies team only won 59 games. So while, yes, you can have a lousy team, a starting pitcher can often overcome all of that. There are many different factors that influence a baseball game, and some are obvious and some are subtle. We're going to go over 5 of them today. However, be sure to stick around to the end of this video because I want to be very clear on how you can apply all this information to your baseball betting. Okay, let's get started. The first factor that you need to consider when looking to bet baseball is weather. Now, for many years, there were many professional bettors who bet baseball solely based on the weather effects of each game. Most bettors, when they think of weather effects, immediately think Wrigley Field. It has always been the poster child for weather effects in baseball. The wind effect on a game is so legendary that books, to this day, still do not put out the total for games at Wrigley Field until late in the morning on the day of game. The irony is that Wrigley Field and the area around Wrigley has changed so much over the years that many of those wind effects no longer are even applicable. They built windscreens in the rear of the grandstand to limit the flow of air through the structure, and in the outfield they've built huge scoreboards which cut down on the inbound wind. Wind does still play a role at Wrigley Field, but not nearly to the extent that it once did. But wind is not the extent of weather effects. Did you know that at sea level, each 10-degree rise in temperature above 60 degrees will cause a 1% increase in distance of a fly ball? Did you know that 1 inch lower of a barometric pressure causes a 1.5% increase in distance? Each mile an hour of wind velocity adds 3 feet to a ball's projected distance if going in the same direction as the ball is traveling. These may seem like small effects, but if you have a 90-degree day with a barometer reading of 28.8 inches and a wind blowing out at roughly 5 miles an hour, you could be increasing a fly ball which would normally travel 360 feet to now travel over 400 feet. That's the difference between a deep fly out and a home run in most ballparks. Conversely, those effects can also go against you. Cooler temperatures combined with a high pressure system and a wind blowing in can change a 400-foot home run into a 360-foot fly out. It pays to pay attention to the weather. Now, if you're wondering where I got those stats, it's from this book, The Physics of Baseball. Now, I've talked about this book in the past on a couple different webcasts. I believe this is a very interesting book. It was written by a Yale professor at the request of the Major League Baseball Commissioner Bart Giamatti, and the author is Robert Adair. And in it, he has lots of information and graphs regarding how the atmospheric conditions affect a baseball, launch angle, swing rate, the temperature of the ball itself, humidity levels. Everything comes into play in this book called The Physics of Baseball. It is not a big book by any stretch, and it's fairly cheap, and I recommend if you're interested in these sort of things, this is a fascinating book to read. I'm going to have a link to it in the show notes below. Next, let's talk about something that goes hand in hand with weather effects, and that is park effects. So because largely how the weather affects a game also depends on the atmospheric conditions of a ballpark, you need to be able to identify how different ballparks play in different conditions. Baseball is unique in that compared to all the other major U.S. sports, baseball is not played on a uniform playing surface. We're familiar with the different quirks of Major League Baseball stadiums, the Green Monster in Boston, the short, shallow corner grandstands in LA at Dodger Stadium. However, the poster child for park effects really is Coors Field in Denver, Colorado. Now, everyone knows that the thinner air of the high altitude causes an increase in the ball's flight. Anyone who's watched a game being played at Coors Field in Denver has seen this. The broadcasters always talk about it. But here's the actual stats of it: is every 1,000 feet above sea level adds roughly 7 feet to the ball's distance in flight. So with Denver being 5,200 feet above sea level, that's about 35 feet added to the average fly ball. Now, when the park designers realized this, they pushed the walls way back to create a larger field that they'd have to try to hit the ball out of. But that then created a cavernous outfield. And one of the other effects of altitude on the ball is that the arc of flight is sharper. So as a result, the ball dives down faster. That's being hit into the outfield at a quicker rate, and this also leads to more doubles and triples. And Coors Field has led the league in doubles and triples as well as home runs throughout its entire existence. But beyond Coors Field, there are other stadiums where altitude plays a factor. Now, the next highest altitude stadium to Coors Field is in Arizona, Chase Field in Phoenix. And that's only 1,090 feet above sea level. So it doesn't have quite the strong impact that Coors Field does. In fact, the desert heat is probably more of an impact there to offensive production, even though the stadium has a roof. Conversely, those stadiums built at sea level, especially those built near the coast that could be susceptible to a marine layer of atmospheric conditions, often have like an anti-altitude effect on baseball. As a result, the ball doesn't travel as far. The air is thicker, and it's a little bit tougher to hit a fly ball out than it would be in other parks. And we see that a lot in the California parks. A lot of them are near the coast, and as a result, that marine layer settles in the late afternoon, early evening, and affects baseball travel through most of those games. Now, beyond that, the way that baseball parks are shaped often comes into their park factors. For instance, some parks are susceptible to wind only in a certain direction. Other parks are built like a brick house, and the wind plays no role no matter the direction or the velocity. Some have a greater susceptibility to doubles and triples and home runs. It's a good idea to be familiar with every park. You can look up park factors easily enough. They're available from a variety of sources, from ESPN to Fangraphs, or you could even calculate your own if you so are inclined. But be cognizant of changes to ballparks each year. Sometimes fences are moved in or out. Sometimes stadiums are changed in other ways. If a ballpark has a retractable roof, you better know if the roof is planned to be open or shut for the next game. We've seen some parks open or close the roof in mid-game even, and that's always something to look for as well. Also, the park surface also comes into play. So some parks are good for certain pitchers. Now, back when we had a mix of AstroTurf and real grass fields, the dichotomy between playing on the two fields was much more pronounced. If you had a ground ball pitcher pitching on grass, there was often a high probability that the infield would get to the ball and field the ball cleanly because the grass would slow it down. However, if they were pitching on the faster AstroTurf, the ball would rocket through the infield, and it often led to more hits with a ground ball pitcher pitching on a turf field. Nowadays, the turf fields are very grass-like, and there is not quite a big difference in play. However, it's still worth noting that a fly ball pitcher pitching in a park like Cincinnati is going to have a much tougher time of it than if he was pitching in San Diego. The way the parks are built just comes into play in terms of shorter fences and less distance to hit a home run. So you need to know your pitchers, and you need to know how the park will affect them. And here's a tip for learning more about the characteristics of ballparks. Watch the visiting team's broadcast. Their broadcasters are more likely to point out the quirks of a ballpark than the home broadcasters, who often have already covered that in previous broadcasts and games and earlier in the season or in years past. Another tip is use Google Earth if you want to kind of get a scope of view out of the ballpark from all the different angles. That's a good tool to kind of do a 360 view of the ballpark and the effects around it. So next up is the lineup. Now, baseball is a grueling sport, and most of the teams play 6 days a week, and in this current season, the teams are playing 9 out of 10 days, and even more so when they need to make up games. So baseball managers need to be cognizant and be able to rest the key players when they can. And a bettor also needs to recognize that, especially when rest is happening to some of the star players on a team that impact the offensive production. Those of you who bet DFS know that lineups are posted roughly 3 to 4 hours before the first pitch. However, those of you who are just recreationally betting baseball might not realize that you get the lineups about 3 to 4 hours before the first pitch. You can find them on some various websites. A lot of DFS websites carry that kind of information. And it's usually a quick rush to go ahead and see what changes are in, what key players may be sitting, or the batting order may have changed. So it's often key to see how the lines are moving and see if you can catch on any of those line moves. But if you're betting baseball, you need to have a general idea of what the lineup is going to be even before it's posted. Left-right splits are key in baseball. In other words, teams do not generally like to load up left-handed bats against a left-handed pitcher. It's tougher for them to hit. Right on right, not quite the same factor, but left on left is definitely a factor. So the pronounced drop in effectiveness is key, and you could kind of plan for that ahead of time. So if the team has a couple powerhouse left-handed batters, but they're going to be facing a left-handed hitter, there's a good chance, well, maybe one of them will be sitting, or they'll break them up in the lineup. But you can generally assume that left-handed batters are not going to have quite the same day against a left-handed pitcher. You should also take into consideration that the batting order. So this is especially important for prop bettors. The higher in the batting order you are, the more chances you're going to get to bat. So the more chances for offense. And conversely, if you're lower in the batting order, you probably will get fewer at-bats. So if you are betting into something that requires, how many hits a player is going to get, or you're keying off a player for DFS purposes, you should probably wait until you know where in the batting order they will be, because that's going to be key information. Now, while keeping up with the batting lineup is important, it's also very important to keep up with the bullpen lineup, especially the usage of the bullpen, and that brings us to our fourth hidden factor in betting baseball, bullpen usage. So in today's Major League Baseball, the bullpen has a large effect on the game. Specifically, a porous bullpen can be very dangerous. Sometimes bullpens can have bright spots, and it's important to know when those bright spots are not available to be used in the next game. A team that also has heavy bullpen usage over a number of games may often require their starter to go deeper into the game in a subsequent start, and that should be taken into consideration as well. It's worth noting that in Major League Baseball 2020, however, the rosters are expanded. It's going to be 28 people on the roster for the rest of the season now, and that's 3 more typical than in previous seasons. As a result of this, there are a couple more arms in the bullpen than there usually are, and that will cut down on overusage of bullpens, especially with all these games being so tight together. But you should still keep track of if they used a setup man 2 or 3 days in a row, he probably is not going to go on a third or fourth day. If they have a star closer who's closed 2 or 3 straight games, they're not going to probably use him on a third or fourth day. So you definitely need to keep an eye on how the bullpens are used, what the usage is in the bullpen, and how that could affect your wagering. And if you find yourself that you're the victim of faulty bullpens too often, I would encourage you to consider betting first 5-inning lines instead. It helps cut the bullpens out of the equation, and a lot of players kind of gravitate towards that when they don't want to deal with some of the bad bullpens that are out there. So the final hidden factor of betting baseball is umpires. So now this is another angle that some pro bettors used to use almost exclusively to pick their games. Umpiring has always been a subjective skill, and as such, there are some that do it consistently better or worse than their peers. There are umpires who have large strike zones, and then there are others that have strike zones the size of a phone book. Umpire information for the first game of a series typically comes out about an hour before game time. However, for all subsequent games in that series, the umpires move clockwise. So in other words, the first base umpire today will be the home plate umpire tomorrow. The home plate umpire today will be the third base umpire tomorrow. Now these days, umpires are beginning to fall in line. We don't have as many outliers as we used to. The outliers are slowly aging out of the game. Each year, new umpires get called up from the minor leagues into the majors, and for the most part, these new umpires generally call a pretty consistent game. There are still some gems out there that are consistently bad with their oversized or undersized strike zones, and finding over and under umpire records is actually pretty easy if you Google it. However, don't go by that. Look closer at the actual metrics of called third strikes and of strikeouts to walk ratios and of how they perform in full counts. These are the stats that are actually more predictive on how an umpire will go from that point forward. Just taking the over-under record, that's actually not such strong statistical data. There's a lot of factors that can come involved in there. It's usually more of a false positive in many of those situations. Now, knowing these things is actually very important for certain pitchers. Because here's the thing, pitchers know the umpires and the batters know the umpires as well. So it's important to know that a batter may be more selective if they know they're dealing with an umpire that has a very small strike zone. And they may need to be more aggressive if the umpire has a larger strike zone. And pitchers know this as well. They can work the corners more aggressively when they have a larger strike zone. And anyway, this all compounds together when the batters need to swing more wildly, when the pitchers can pinpoint the fringe, the corners of the plate. It has a compounding effect, and it largely results in a skewed strikeout to walk ratio. And of course, base runners, if they get on base via walks, that translates to runs eventually. So definitely pay attention to umpires and how they call the game. So there you have 5 hidden factors of betting baseball, but there's one key point that I do want to mention still, and that is everything I've mentioned today is already factored into the line by the time the game starts. These angles, such as weather effects, park effects, lineups, bullpens, umpires, all at one time or another have provided edges and angles for savvy bettors. But markets tend towards efficiency, and all of them are largely normalized now into the betting lines. Don't fool yourself into thinking that all these things that I've mentioned are somehow a magic formula to beating baseball. All of these factors should be part of your handicapping process, whether it be qualitatively or quantitatively. However, you need to realize that if you know them, then the large betting syndicates that dictate market movement also know them. You may have a better chance playing these angles earlier in the market, maybe betting overnights or betting early morning lines, but in some cases the vital information can't be known in advance, it can only be guessed upon. For instance, in the case of weather, I often see it factored in even starting with the overnight lines. Now, there are services out there that will try to tell you how to quantify the game's weather effects, but their analysis, unfortunately, is largely flawed. They don't take into account the total line, but rather they just take into account the historical context of the weather. It's not surprising that runs are higher in Kansas City in July as opposed to April. Everyone can recognize that, and the line is going to reflect that from the beginning. Now, they pretend that the line doesn't seem to know that, but it does. Similarly, the lineup changes get factored in extremely fast. If you're realizing that just before game time that some slugger is sitting tonight, it's too late. It's already factored into the line. There's nothing you can really do with that information. And of course, I mentioned with umpires, people tend to look at their over-under record solely and without looking at the actual underlying metrics that contribute to that record, and that's a fallacy there. So as you can see, these 5 hidden factors are often hiding in plain sight to the way the line is constructed. Now, my advice for anyone looking to use a combination of these factors in their handicapping is to look at smaller derivative and prop markets instead. Leverage that information there. Now, you're going to find in many cases that it's already factored in there as well, but not to the efficient nature that sides and totals are, because the sides and totals are a much more high liquidity, faster moving market. So also keep in mind that inefficiency is a two-way street. So you can have instances where a market overreacts to factors, and that can be just as profitable if you're able to identify that the market has overmoved on a situation. And that can sometimes apply to sides and totals, but you're going to see that more in props and derivatives as well. Anyway, that'll about do it for this episode. As always, if you have comments or questions, utilize the comments section below. I'll be checking them. I'll reply to any relevant question or comment, and we can talk more about maybe some other factors that you've seen or identified, or maybe you want a little bit more clarity in some of these factors on this video. Be glad to talk about it further. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and click on that subscribe button, and you'll stay on the leading edge of whatever content that I put out. But that's going to do it for this episode, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.